Hello, everyone, and welcome to the new year. We have our first meeting with Jeff Yoshimi. He's well known, but a few words to introduce him. Jeff Yoshimi is professor and founding faculty member at UC Merced in the Department of Philosophy and Cognitive and Information Sciences. His research areas include the Husserl phenomenology and neural networks, philosophy of cognitive science, and visualization of complex processes. He was a student of Bert Dreyfus and UC Berkeley, of David Woodruff Smith at UC Irvine, and of the Churchlands at UCSD. He was involved in relaunching the CPC in the early 2000s. So we look forward to your talk today, Jeff. The floor is all yours. Thanks for all of you being here.
Thank you, Susie, and hello, everybody. I think I need a share permission. Again, it's good to see everybody. Good to see some familiar faces. Here we go. All right. So everybody can see this. All right. So today I'll be giving this talk on eidetic laws. I changed the title. It was as code comments, now as software requirements for the code running the matrix. If you saw the post online, I did want to put "hear me out" in front of that. It does sound pretty wacky, but hopefully I'll motivate it for you over the course of the talk. The lead quote is from Ideas 1, a world's existence is the correlate of certain experiential manifolds, distinguished by certain essential configurations. The broad idea is, and I think this is a key idea in Husserl, is that we're confronted with experience, and that experience does not unfold randomly, but there's a certain structure to it, and the existence of a stable, enduring world of everything around us that we take for granted really can be reduced to these certain invariant structures in the stream of experience, and those are essences. And I'm going to try and make sense of that with an extended metaphor. So this first slide says more or less the same thing that I just said. Kind of put yourself, just to get the idea out there, put yourself into a kind of idealistic or Cartesian or even Berkeleyan frame of mind. All we have access to is the kind of streaming data of conscious experience. And then notice that experience is not a random chaos of sensation. There is a certain structure to it. This is, there's things we can control, but there's a lot we can't, the old Stoic idea. And the stuff we can't control is, we can't just, I have a cup of water here in front of me. I can't just make it disappear or turn into a dragon. When I press on the sides of the cup, it feels a certain, it gives me a certain resistance. And it's a kind of argument against solipsism, you could say. It's just that it's not just me, right? There is something beyond me that is producing structure in the world. There may be echoes of this in the history of philosophy and the principle of sufficient reason, or in the Fichte's Anstoß, or again, the Stoic, what's beyond me that I can't control. And I think this is the kind of key thing Husserl's getting at with transcendental eidetic phenomenology. And, of course, Kant as well, that there is just, even if we restrict ourselves to what is sort of given in immediate experience, we run up against these different pressures and constraints. And Husserl, mathematician by training, thought we could study this, and that structure was actually at the basis of pretty much every science, every domain of inquiry, and science, empirical science in particular. It's a kind of notable fact. People think of the logical positivists as being very hard science-y, but they were influenced by Husserl, Carnap and Schlick in particular, and they are grounding, certain versions of logical positivism are grounded in this same idea, right? Regularities in sense data and sense experience. And so again, I'm going to give an interpretation of these using a kind of extended concrete analogy to the matrix. So my purpose here is basically Husserl interpretation a lot like in my 2016 book. It was like, let's just try and formally reconstruct some of what Husserl has to say about a topic. It's not pure interpretation. As we'll see, Husserl's theory of essence is extremely complicated, like everything in Husserl. So I'm not going to try and do justice to every feature of the theory. It's perfect timing for the thought. A frog decided to take residence in my throat. That's beyond me. I just couldn't control that. It just happened. I would have liked that it didn't. So there should be an essence for those. So I'm treating phenomenology kind of in the spirit of Hubert Dreyfus. He would say his approach to Heidegger, it's one thing to try. Hakamanish has some nice work on this, different approaches to Heidegger. It's one thing, this is how Dreyfus would say, to try and get all the words exactly correct and to do perfect philological interpretation of the text. It's another thing to just look at examples and try and figure out, well, what's going on here? What's really the case? And so I think I agree with most of Husserl's theory, but I may depart on some particulars. All right. So again, this is Husserl interpretation with allowance for some departures. I'm not focused on cognitive science here, but it should be relevant. Again, this came up in my book. It was, by making this theory especially perspicuous and clear, that should facilitate links to cognitive science. And Johannes, some of our conversations are in the background of this. And caveat emptor, this is very much in the CPC spirit of think we're in somebody's living room with some coffee, and it's just kind of working things out, sort of an initial working out of these ideas. Husserl thought phenomenology was a social enterprise. It's a living thing that should be done together, and that you talk to other people and get corrected on things and see new perspectives. And it's in that kind of exploratory initial stage, even though I've had this idea for a long time. And I don't know when I've got a lot of stuff on the queue, so I don't know when I'll actually end up publishing this, but I certainly want to. So, okay. That said, the plan now is I'm going to give you some background on essences in Husserl. I'm going to give you extended matrix analogy. I'll talk a little bit about the relationship to cognitive science, and I'll end with some kind of open questions. So essences, so Husserl talks about essences throughout his career. They really become prominent in the period between the philosophy of arithmetic and the logical investigations. The failure of psychologism, the critique from Frege, all that stuff, influence from Lotze and Bolzano, all that stuff seemed to play in. Claire Ortiz Hill has some very good work on this. And of course, by the investigations, we have things like intentional essence. The term shows up quite a bit in the investigations, but then it's extremely prominent and really takes center stage in the Ideas trilogy. And of course, Ideas opens with this section on fact and essence. And then he maintains this interest throughout his career. I especially like the discussion in phenomenological psychology. I don't know if you can see that. It's like lectures from the summer semester of 1925. So Husserl was pretty late. He was in his 60s. And that's more or less, I think that was a source material that got worked into the discussion in Experience and Judgment, which some of Mike Shim, I think I got this from you, like co-authored with Landgrebe. So this is I like the discussion here. It's detailed and but it's the lecture courses are a little. I think he sometimes made things a little worse when he revised them. So a little more raw, I guess. There is also now Husserliana 41, which is organized into sort of each of these periods I just talked about and giving you lots of source material. Now, the basic idea of an essence is something like an atemporal form. I think, David, you like that, this concept of form. Amy Thomason, this is a little bit of secondary literature, has some work where she describes that. So, they're seeing a particular red apple is one thing, and then you shift your attention kind of to the redness of the apple, to the type apple. And that's this contemplation of an essence versus a particular. And her concern there is to make this Husserlian apparatus friendly to analytic philosophy. She links it to Carnap and meta-ontological deflationism. And I do tend to like this, but essences can be a lot more complicated than like a type or a species, or perhaps they still are, but there's complicated types for complicated species. And so I'm not sure exactly how my account relates to Amy's or David's, but I think they're certainly in the same spirit. Um, and I'll also mention some other work. There's actually Roca Soa, I'm not sure I'm getting his name correctly, has done pretty detailed work on it, and Claudio Maggiolino has,
Maiolino.
thank you. Did I pronounce it wrong?
No, it's
You're
okay.
getting
It's okay. Maiolino. Yeah.
Maiolino. Thank you. Thank you. I'm okay. Well, he has done some really detailed work on these concepts. This is a chart from one of his papers, and there's a lot of distinctions to be made. I don't know that I follow Claudio on all of this, or actually, probably I think he's a pretty good Husserl interpreter. Maybe I don't follow Husserl on every last distinction. Some of these sub distinctions between, pure essence as distinct from exact and morphological essence. That's where I said I'm going to do mostly Husserl interpretation, but I'm not going to, try and drill down to every last detail. And some of this feels a little scholastic to me. But I haven't fully worked out how I feel about all of that. So I'm going to pull out a core kind of idea. Let me present it now. See something in chat. Um, okay. So a brief reconstruction. So you take some episode in the stream of consciousness. This doesn't have to be something actually happening. It could be you're imagining something in the stream of consciousness, in your stream of imagination in that case. And then with it, so we perform reduction, right? We exclude consideration of extra phenomenological considerations. We just look at what's given to us. And then we focus on some part, some mereological part or some object in the stream and consider its type. So we look at, I'll give the example of a bottle, and we consider it an exemplar of the type of material thing, let's say. And now he calls this possibilizing it. You stop looking at it as an actual bottle, but you think of it as one bottle in the space of all possible bottles or all possible material things. And then you vary it within that space while staying within the type you specified. So you do in the second step need to focus on some type. And then you make variations within that type. And then whatever remains invariant in this process of varying the object within the type is an essence. And then eidetic laws are like statements or judgments about these essences. So to expand with a picture, suppose I'm at the park and my friend throws me a bottle of water and we got music, there's all this stuff happening. And then I decide to do some phenomenology. I put that moment in brackets and identify the different things that are happening. I'm experiencing this bottle. I've got some protensions, some retentions. There's a lot of stuff happening. I'm aware of myself. I'm aware of this intentional relation between myself and the bottle. I just decide to focus on this. And I say, well, the bottle is instantiating many types, one of them being material thing. And so I'll think of the set of all material things, all possible material things, and think of this actual bottle as an instance of a possible water bottle. And then I start to vary it. I can imagine it's much larger. I think of the ecological impact of the bottle, and I decide to shift to a wooden cup. Maybe I decide to think of a giraffe, and then I make the giraffe larger or smaller. And I know the whole time I'm doing this, it has not stopped being a material thing. So I'm varying the object within the space of material things. There's a story, I don't know where I heard it, of Husserl got annoyed with a seminar attendee and applied the method of free variation and transformed him into a ball of yarn or something. So that stays within the space of material things, not within animate things. So he did move out of that one. And of course, I moved out of the set of bottles, right, in this example. So then anything constant across this variation is going to be, at least a candidate for an essence of the class, an essence of material things. So let's give some, yeah, all right, well, here's some quotes. I think it's always tricky giving quotes from Husserl. They never do quite what you want, do they? Or they're written not in the most direct way. But let's see how these do. This is from Phenomenological Psychology. Whenever I'm to arrive at the seeing of red by varying, I must maintain the direction towards red, so he's staying within this type of redness, or amid all other arbitrariness of the varying, I must restrict myself in one way. If when I am commencing the variation, a common red shines before me, then I can immediately hold it fast and mean and want to mean nothing else than red taken universally. The commonly identical moment yields to optional further variation. If green appears, I reject it as not belonging, as clashing with the red. Um, and then he goes on to say, the result of these complex mental activities is an eidos, this Platonic idea, this essential universal. And I will note, it's interesting in the places where he discusses eidetic variation essences, always he stays focused on the phenomenology, the phenomenology of the method of identifying essences. So I've given some sort of simple examples of like a material thing or redness, but they can be actually quite complicated and involve a lot of detailed features. These are some of the simpler ones. These involve ontological dependence, which is of interest to David. Anytime you think of an extension, that extension always has some color, right? So vary within the space of extended or of experienced extensions, and all of those experienced extensions will involve some coloring. Similarly, any experience of a color will have to take up some space, some extension. But here's some more complicated ones. If you're in a stable environment, this is from Thing in Space, a determinate head movement will produce a determinate experience. So my screen isn't changing now. And so every time I look up to the right, I see kind of the same thing. Every time I look down, I see your faces on the Zoom screen. And assuming there aren't changes, that should continue to be the case, right? It's an essence of the class of, now look at how complicated it gets, right? I guess you could say head movements in a stable environment, that each possible movement is going to be associated with a unique visual experience, right? If you look and it changes, then you're not, no, it's a changing environment or just a different kind of situation. If you take a stable object like this mug and I turn it around, uh, then as I turn it, I should have a repeating sequence of experiences. Um, if you experience a boundary, this is from Analyses of Active and Passive Synthesis, which Ron, we read many years ago. There should be a change in the color gradient, right? The boundary of this bee, it goes from white to black. That's how I could see this boundary. You can't see all sides of a transcendent object at once, right? This is the essential inadequacy of experience. This is an essence of material things, which I was just looking at. You can only see them from one side or another. And you may be thinking some of this seems awfully contingent. And he does say in multiple places that all of these essences are conditionalized to creatures like us, right? In fact, here's a quote: if we freely vary, but we stipulate that variance must be optional tones of the world, tones heard or able to be heard by human beings on Earth. Um, so that essences are related to our factually actual world and restricted to this all-inclusive fact. So there's this, these are like consequence of a conditional, which is like, if you are a human with the kind of perceptual apparatus we have, then this invariant structure obtains. All right, so that's, yeah, all right, so there's more. So then there's all these phenomenology is organized into these different domains, right? There's the essences of physical objects, of logical constructs, of fictional worlds, of social cultural worlds, of values and morality, of psychology and different domains of science. And so if you just scroll through the Husserliana, you see like just whole books on like intersubjectivity and the constitution of social worlds and the essences of that constitution. And so a lot of, I think, this infinite task of phenomenology in Husserl's mind is spelling out all these different eidetic domains, and in his mind, placing all of the sciences on this kind of phenomenological foundation. And so again, we have this kind of foundationalism, all sciences, it's basically for this idealistic reason that everything that we know about is given in experience, and the thing I started with, every kind of regularity of experience can be cashed out as what he calls an essence. So we've got this whole hierarchy of rules, each governing its own domain, and that kind of, again, cashes out that kind of idea from the first slide. And you can think another way to think of this is a kind of expanded Kant. We have not just the forms of space and time and the 12 categories of the understanding, but this infinite expanding set of essences in this vast hierarchy, and we engage in this kind of social project. This was his dream, right? Where we kind of, Reinach, you're going to work on the essences of law and legal systems, and Shaler, you'll go work on values and love, and so we'll get through all the domains of human experiences, this sort of slowly expanding understanding of these invariant structures. All right. So now let's move on to the matrix analogy. And first, apologies for using AI. I don't like when I see a talk and I see AI generated figures. That's just my personal taste, but it was just natural to do here because it's kind of a complicated analogy. So the idea here, why am I doing a matrix analogy? All this stuff I just said is extremely abstract. And it just helps to have like a concrete thought experiment to understand what's going on, or to at least pose an interpretation of what's going on. And so that's what I'm going to do here. I assume everybody's seen The Matrix. Has anybody not seen The Matrix? I can't see all your faces, but maybe put in chat if you haven't. You all know we're in we're in these pods and the frogs returned. The Matrix architects hear me talking about them, so they initiated frog suit routine. There they are. All right. So the idea is that here's this brain. Inputs are being sent in from a computer. Outputs are being from the brain, like motor commands are being sent back out. And then in response, sort of meaningful sensory inputs are sent back in. And we could thereby create a virtual kind of experience of a world, one that could in principle be indistinguishable from our experience. Indeed, we may now be in a matrix situation right now. Now it's sort of an expanded matrix scenario because I want to imagine that these programmers can control not just our outer sensory experience, but our emotions, what thoughts kind of bubble up. And so we imagine the electrodes are sunk in all the way into most of the neurons in the brain. Johannes, go ahead.
Oh, apologies. I didn't know.
Ah,
Did I raise my hand? Oh, sorry about
you
that.
did. No
That was a
problem.
mistake. Sorry. I think I want to send
No
thumbs
problem.
up that I've seen the Matrix.
Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, so now notice we could imagine you didn't have a lot of money, so you could only hire one person to run this thing. You could imagine a very simple program for each electrode, send in a random activation at each time step. All right, so you just do one giant loop, and that would not produce meaningful experience, right? And this actually has a correlate in this. This is out of order. But I'll just say it, right? If we did that, we would get something like what Husserl calls a maelstrom, right? Meaningless sensations, if that. And so he gives this thought experiment. He said, couldn't all perception ultimately be an illusion of reality? Couldn't it be that from one temporal moment on, all harmonious fulfillment, all this kind of stable connectedness of experience would cease, and the series of appearances would run into one another in such a way that no positive unity could be maintained? Could it not happen that all fulfillment could cease completely and the entire stream of appearance dissolve into a tumult of meaningless sensations? This would be a chaos, right? Nothing, no apprehension of things could be maintained. None of this stability required to see things would be there. It's not nothingness, right? There'd still be some kind of, at least Husserl claims, right? This is actually not really known because you couldn't go through this and remember what happened, I don't think. But it's nothing that can itself constitute a world of things, assuming, so it's just this kind of, again, this complete randomness. And so there's got to be structure, and that's why we need a big team of programmers. This looks very unpleasant for these poor people. They're in this exploited matrix sweatshop, producing inputs that are kind of meaningful responses to the outputs from the brain that they're creating a simulated experience in. So there's got to be some structure to what's happening. All right. And in fact, most, if not all, actually, as I was thinking about, some tricky cases came up, but most of those essences would correspond to things that the matrix programmers would have to take account of. Check the chat real quick. They if you move towards a stationary object, so you register that you're showing somebody a cup, right? That's the experience of cup signals are being sent in, and then it's like, oh, Jeff's moving his arm towards his face. We better make that cup appear larger in the visual field. That would be something that would have to be captured in the program. Similarly, for turning an object and having repeating experiences or eye movements in a stationary environment, producing determinate experiences for each eye movement. And so what does this mean in a computer program? And I realized I had software requirements, but or software or code comments, but it's really a lot like what are sometimes called requirements. Now, software requirements are an old concept in software engineering. And the idea is that before you start writing a program, you go out and talk to the people who are going to use it, the stakeholders, and you might yourself have a sense as one of the designers, and you kind of get together and you write down, here's all the things this software should do. And then as you implement them, you kind of check them off. And I remember I worked at a software company in the 90s and they did this kind of analysis and it was huge, just hundreds of pages. I think it was a big book of these requirements. People have gotten away from that, right? You may have heard of agile programming. It's much more iterative, but it's still an idea. It's, I think, there at some level in most software engineering, even down to just you're having a discussion with somebody and it's like, look, on a whiteboard, at this stage, we want it to do these things. And the thing about it is it's not the code itself, right? It's a statement of what the code should do. And it's written in natural language and it's supposed to facilitate discussion between, it's something you can understand and talk about. And, there's different kinds of requirements, and we could talk more about that. And these would be sort of some of them, yeah, I won't get into the details. Well, a little bit, right? Some requirements are really for things in the guts of the program. We have what you might call like end user or user facing requirements, or kind of like screen, or what should the screen do where the screen is our experience, right? And these correspond to like these, once you read a requirement, there should be some way to verify it and test it. And that's like an invariant. I think that is an invariant. Anytime you test it, it should do this thing. And so it's a repeatable, verifiable invariant structure that is manifest in the program. Mike, go ahead.
Just a point of clarification. When you say that essences are not the actual invariant structures, but the statements, is that a claim of equivalence, or is it something else? Like there are statements which can be accurate or inaccurate about the invariant structure, but it's not reducible. But the invariant structure is not reducible to something, I take it, linguistic?
Yeah, that's basically the claim here. And I don't know if I've been fully consistent about this, so I'm glad you brought that up. And hopefully we can come back to that in the official discussion. Husserl does distinguish his essences from judgments about essences or statements about them. And so the eidetic law is more the statement about the essence. And I think maybe, I don't know if this is in Husserl, but I think these regularities are often extremely hard to express in language. And so yeah, I think there's maybe more of a gap than he realized between the two. So this might be a slight departure from Husserl, something that he doesn't make explicit. Yeah, I'm tempted to write that down, but remind me if I don't, Mike, because that's a good point. Okay, and then in answering Mike's question, it's this other part, right? It's like there's the invariant structure is one thing. It might be extremely complicated, right? A computer program might have all kinds of characteristics of what it's doing just out of the structure of it that go kind of beyond what the requirements express. Okay, so that's how this part of the analogy works. And to extend the analogy a little further, in Husserl, we had this giant hierarchy, this regional ontology with like a whole hierarchy of essences and this infinite task of working them out. And there's something similar here, right? Any code base, any large code base is going to be organized into things like packages or classes and sets of classes, what might generically be called modules, each handling a different thing, each more or less encapsulated but loosely coupled to other parts. And each of them is going to have like, you know, a bunch of packages going to have a lot of classes and subclasses and functions within those, each of which is going to have its own kind of invariant structures. And so that kind of corresponds here, right? In the code for the matrix, there'd be the, you know, how to produce experiences of physical objects, of other agents, of sounds and smells, of abstract objects. And so the regularities the programmers have to code in to these different modules kind of correspond to the different regularities that we experience when interacting with these different kinds of things. Not kind of, I'm arguing do correspond. Okay, so that's the analogy. Let me just make a few more points. First, just another analogy, and this is the link to cognitive science. And Johannes, a lot of this came out of our discussions. But suppose a Martian discovers, this is a classic philosopher's thing, Martians come and discover something. They discover a Pac-Man machine, but they don't have the ability to open up. All they could do is like use the joystick and the buttons and kind of figure out things like whenever I push the joystick to the left, if there's no wall in the way, it'll go to the left. When there's dots there, it gobbles them up. When it hits a ghost, it gets destroyed. And they could write out their theory of what's happening. And that would be kind of like a set of essences of Pac-Man, right? Invariant structures of this Pac-Man thing. And so, right, and this is kind of analogous to what happens in eidetic phenomenology, where we're kind of like Martians with respect to ourselves. We don't know quite what's doing it, but we know that when we do certain things, there's a certain structure to it. So it's kind of like we're observing our own Pac-Man and elucidating the invariant structures we intuit. This is the scope of the talk, is to this point. Now we could further imagine, all right, now we give the Martians the ability to open this up and look inside. And again, Johannes, some of our discussions touched on this. And then they would start to figure out, oh, well, there's these circuits, they're transmitting electrical energy. Looks like something like a transistor. And then they might even figure out, like, it looks like there's some abstraction of a language is being kind of run on top of it. They just might figure out what's happening. And in a similar way, in naturalized phenomenology, there's this effort to look at how these experiences that we have arise out of the structure of the brain. And so like the Martians with access are kind of analogous to like a naturalized phenomenologist. But note that even before you get to that, there's still this project of carefully describing what's happening. As if you like writing the requirements, hey, we want to make Pac-Man back in Mars with our own stuff. Here's the structure of the Pac-Man program. Here's a formal specification in terms of a list of requirements for our Martian engineers to follow. And so that I think this helps maybe extend the analogy, mix in one more metaphor in a way that highlights how I see this as relating to cognitive science. So there's a lot of questions here. I'm not going to go over these. I'm sure you'll ask a lot of things here. But as we transition to the Q&A, how did I do on time? Not bad.
You're there.
I will, what I like to do is I just leave the PowerPoint here and you could just see all my garbage down here and I'll take notes. And in fact, I want to write down, Mike Shim, relation between essences as invariant or as statements about them that simplify and structure. I don't know if I fully captured it. But anyway, that's it. And I guess we could move to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for this wonderful presentation. Very fascinating. And yeah, I open the floor to questions.
Should I field questions, Susie? I don't mind.
I see Michael, raising his hand, and
Okay.
he can start.
Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, thanks, Jeff. So just going back to this early issue about the relationship between essences and statements. Now, by statement, do you mean like something propositional or conceptual independently of some kind of linguistic token? Or do you mean by statement something that's like literally linguistic?
You're talking about like the distinction between like an utterance and the propositional form of the utterance.
Yeah.
I guess conflating them. I don't think that distinction matters much to this, but maybe you could explain a way in which it does matter. I think it's a legitimate distinction. And there's this kind of yeah, you could study the essences of both of those things and how they're related.
Well, it seems like one way of
Wait,
I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
actually, I mean, I guess really the propositions are what matters, right? Not the not the utterances of them. I guess, yeah, you're forced to choose. But go ahead, Mike.
Oh, because there are like these really weird passages. I don't remember clearly from Ideas 1 where he says something like he has an association between essences and what he claims are ideas, and that's why they're called eidetic, right? And then he goes, and by idea, I mean concept. Do you remember that passage? It's a
No.
circular passage. It's a circular passage. He says something like, and if people ask me what concepts are, my answer is they're ideas. And if they ask me what ideas are, I say, well, they're concepts. But if you kind of take that conceptual content as independent of any particular linguistic token or any particular language, right, then it seems to be more plausible, albeit in some other way, maybe more mysterious. Do you see what I'm saying?
Wait, say the last part again.
Like if we can think of like conceptual content or propositional content as what he's talking about when he talks about essences, then it's independent of any particular language unless you're expressing it. It seems the thesis here would be more plausible. So what you basically said, what's important are the propositions and conceptual contents, not any particular language. And that would then disambiguate what you mean by statements to mean something not explicitly linguistic, but just something like conceptual content or something like this in the background.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think he's making a general distinction, even if he's sloppy in some places, and he is clear about this, between concepts and judgments on the one hand and the essences on the other, right? Because you could express, you just notice that there's this common structure as you vary, and that's independent. It's like a separate, think of the phenomenology, right? When you then say, oh, look, anytime I do this, that happens, right? That statement is just a separate structure from, the actual thing you've noticed.
But it seems like it's conceivable that you have an experience of an invariant structure or something like this, and then you just don't know the words for them. That's what I
yeah,
mean. But yeah.
I see. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, that's
this issue of the boundedness to like your particularity, I think, is in the background, which also kind of goes into the language points you're making, right? Some of your language may be coloring things. But yeah, the key of all the stuff you've said, I mean, there's a lot going on. I don't know that I addressed it all, but this thing of like, it's hard to capture in language, right? There's essences that may go beyond what you could easily express in language. And I think, yeah, so there's essences can go beyond
But
what you
the
can
reason why you seem to emphasize the linguistic part is because your emphasis on the communal cooperative nature of the project that you're talking about, right?
That's right.
Clearly, you can't have communicate. I can communicate the invariant structure that I pre-linguistically experienced to you unless I can be translated into a language thing. I guess that's why I emphasize it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But then that does mean that there is no easy identification with essences and statements.
That's true. That's a really good point. And actually, he says that there is such a identification, right? I think there's this. He says it's a matter of essence that to any essence there is a judgment about it or something like that. And I think it might not be so easy. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Thanks. Mark, I think, is next.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, Jeff, could you scroll back to the software requirements slide?
Yeah.
Let's see here. So somewhere, okay, so you this bullet point about being more or less formal, right? So these natural language requirements, I would consider them to be informal. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen one of these mathematical specification languages like TLA plus.
No, but I think I know.
Okay, so the idea is that before you write code, you express it in a rigorous mathematical formalism. Because, code, once you write it, you're not exactly sure what it does, that it's doing. And so
Right.
something like a formal specification language is like the blueprint against which the quality of the software is ultimately judged. And I was just wondering if a formal specification might be a bit closer to what you're getting at than these traditional informal requirements.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think this sort of piggybacks off some of what Mike was getting at. This is great. I mean, I don't think Husserl really fully thought about it, but I would imagine there's a role for both in eidetic phenomenology, right? Like in an initial discussion, it's like, hey, it seems to be like this, which would be a more informal. Yeah, and it's a good point, right? Maybe everything, these are more or less informal, like degrees of informal, right? And formal
Yeah.
is more like your TLA plus example. Um, but that as we get better at phenomenology, as we kind of mathematize it, right, we get to a point where we could really formally specify it in something analogous to TLA plus.
Yeah.
And that feels like it's in the spirit of Husserl. And these are just good points that he would accept. It certainly seems reasonable to me.
Cool.
Yeah.
I have one more
Yeah.
one more
Go ahead.
comment, which is
Uh-huh.
that when I saw the title of your talk, I actually didn't think it was weird, because I for a long time I've thought this matrix idea and other skeptical ideas like that in philosophy are extremely relevant to the epoche, trying to describe what epoche is. And in particular, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the simulation hypothesis, right?
Uh-huh.
Well, I mean, that's sort of a piece of metaphysics, which a lot of phenomenologists would maybe not be sympathetic with. But if you change it to the simulation metaphor, I think it provides a potential easy way to explain what the technique of epoche is. And I'm just wondering if you agreed with that. I once mentioned it to Evan Thompson, and he didn't, for whatever reason, seem to be very receptive. So I was just curious if you thought it was off base.
No, I like that. I mean, there's a thing in Chalmers about how the matrix is just kind of an alternative fundamental ontology, or ontology, maybe I should say, uh, where the thing that is common to our understanding of the world and the matrix understanding of the world, or the world in a simulation hypothesis, is just the way things are given, the way they would be in epoche, as you say. And what we're bracketing out is precisely these details that are just beyond our ability to know, like standard scientific realism versus something weird is happening, like the matrix or the simulation hypothesis. We just can't know about any of that. But in a way, by entertaining these strange metaphysical possibilities, it focuses our mind on what's kind of common across them, which is the given in the brackets of epoche. So yeah, I like it.
Yeah, for me, I mean, the purpose of the epoche is to try to unearth structures where it doesn't matter if you're in a simulation or not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's it. And I mean, you see bits of that even as far back as Descartes, right? Even if I really am being deceived or am dreaming, it still seems to me that the fire is warm, right? And so, yeah, it's in that spirit, I think. So good. I'm glad you like that. And I'm certainly seeing it the same way. I could see Evan Thompson not liking a lot of things about this.
David.
You might be muted, David.
Okay, I think I'm here now, right?
Yes.
I got too many things on my mind to listen to what you're doing, so let me take my hand out of the picture there. So I like to see, let's step back out of Husserl interpretation and look at the development of the science that we're talking about here, eidetic phenomenology, transcendental phenomenology, and so on. So going back to Mike's question at the beginning, when are we talking about language and when are we talking about the essences? Bring in some Bolzano and you have a short, sharp, quick answer, and it's right in the back of Husserl's mind. So I didn't know what the word idea was that was being translated in, I think it was Mike was referring to. So Vorstellung an sich, ideas in themselves, that's Bolzano's key notion. And that's exactly what Husserl has in mind and what Ron and I have always been assuming in the background. It's called Frege, but it's really Bolzano, and Dagvin Polostal has emphasized that for as long as possible. But there are a lot of distinctions if we remember the continuity in now taking Husserl as a full run at getting at essences, the experiences of essences, and the expression of the experiences. So all of those distinctions fall nicely in place. Also, if we consider that the logical investigations opens as a phenomenology of language, and the distinctions between the words that we use and the ideal meanings or ideas that they express is sharp from the beginning. So now I think what Jeff was saying falls right into place. This is just an amplification on what Jeff was saying throughout the whole picture here, if we bring in the philosophy of language. Now, to make it complicated, as far I didn't know everybody was speaking now, to make it more complicated when we're talking about essences, if we are looking for the essence of the experience, which involves the idea in itself of another essence, you see how there's an iteration of the very structure of intentionality from the beginning. So to make it more complicated now, Husserl, the mathematician, if he were alive today, so I was very influenced in recent years by Mirya Hartemo's work and Stella Moon, who worked on out of her formations. So now if you think of Husserl living another century, he'd be working about topology and what's called category theory as opposed to set theory. So there are all kinds of increasingly complex forms of eidos or eido essences. So this is just to ramify, I think, exactly what you were saying, Jeff. That brings back to applying the philosophy of language to the practitioner of either let's go with the computer science person. So I'm told that, because I'm a long ways away from this, right? I wanted to tell you when my only course in computer science was taken, there were no departments of computer science. That's the way it goes. So what you're looking at then is more and more complex mathematical structures and their articulation in different forms of language, everyday language here, formal language is there, which Mike was just saying. I don't know who Mike was waving at you. So now the question is, using those more distinctions, what was the idea of what was the description you had before, the informal common discussions of the computer sciences in trying to say what the code is trying to do. So we have different levels of language. To wrap this up as quickly as possible, you got a philosophy of language that involves the phenomenology and essences of two kinds. There are the essences of experiences that gets to the things that Ron and I like to emphasize on Noema and Zen. And then those structures depict, so the word judgment is doing the work of the idea in itself, the Satz an sich in itself, the proposition itself, which characterizes the essences of another type. How did the sense of smell or the sense of touch play in moving around the object and getting more information about it, the complex structure that we call horizon? So you put together these different levels of language, and then we're right back to spelling out where you were going. So enough said, different levels of language, different types of ideal entities, and then you get into the Noema this debate. And so the distinction between the essence of the experience and the Zen or nomadic Zen of the experience is a distinction in two kinds of essences. Finally, then we get the morphological essences and the formal essences that will come in after all of this is taking place. So I think I said too much, but think of applying the phenomenology of language now to the matrix model, and we're just amplifying what you've just said. So enough for me.
Yeah, thank you, David. I'll just say a few things in response. I think that I'm broadly in agreement. First, you mentioned what if Husserl had lived on, right, and come to see category theory, or Mark's been telling me about, was it homotopy type theory?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's what Stella Moon works on primarily.
okay.
Heavily homotopy.
Yeah, right. I think, I mean, I agree. I think again, it's a living discipline. It's an infinite task, and he would have wanted to make use of all the best innovations in mathematics. I also agree that there's different levels happening, this in terms of noesis noema, or separate essences for experiences versus things. Yeah, I mean, this would have to be programmed in, right? It's like, I recognize, in fact, my wife was just saying she keeps having these experiences of cigarette smoke, and it's not sure what the cause is. And that's like saying, but she recognizes it's in her experience, but there's no one smoking cigarettes around. And something like that could happen to any of us. It happens all the time, right? It's like, no, that was in my perception versus the thing out there. And so there's going to be separate structures to be separately programmed in to govern both of those.
And
So yeah,
separate levels of language too. Thus the formal
yes.
languages of the mathematics or the computer science and the
Yeah, and
languages.
right. And those distinctions operate in a few ways, right? In the way that in the kind of discussion with Mark, right, in the specifications of the essences, there's degrees of formality. Then language itself has multiple levels, as you've said, and those language itself has essential structure, right? That just is a recursive thing of we experience language and constitute it, and thus it has an eidetic structure. So anyway, I certainly agree there as well. I think Ron is next. So Smith and then McIntyre.
How about that? Hi, Jeff.
Hello.
This is a more general kind of issue. It's not really a question, I guess. It's prompted by my having just a couple of days ago looked at a TED talk by a guy that I think is a colleague of David's named Donald Hoffman. Are you familiar with him?
Yeah, actually, he was on my master's committee, whatever, pre-dissertation committee.
Yeah, I know.
And I TA'd for him. Yeah.
I knew him quite well a long time ago.
Okay, well, he's apparently making a splash for himself by claiming that everything that we experience is just an illusion, that we don't know what reality is, and so on and so on. And his analogy is that our experience is just like looking at the icons on a desktop, and the reality is something completely different from that. So I'm just kind of curious as to what you think your discussion has to do with the question, what is real? Is the reality the captured by the regularities that are uncovered in the eidetic variation of our experience? Those would be the essences of our experience of things, but not necessarily, I guess, the essence of the things themselves. Just comment on that.
Yeah, Ron, I mean, these are very tricky questions, and thank you for asking that. I think, again, and in Husserl, this is always the case, there's many levels and many distinctions. And I think at one level, there's sort of realism, different kinds of accounts of what's really happening. So again, Mark mentioned like a simulation hypothesis, where we might be in a matrix. These are possibilities of what's real that we can't ever resolve. We can't ever know. These are the pure philosophers' kind of fantasy, right? Thought experiment. And I think I've published on this, that my paper, Metaphysical Neutrality of Husserlian Phenomenology, that we just can't, it's beyond what we could say anything about, really, right? And so through epoche, we just focus on what's given. I think what Don Hoffman's talking about is a kind of an understanding of how we construct our sense of the world that we do have access to. It's the kind of thing that cognitive scientists and biologists and neuroscientists study, going back to, I can't pronounce the name, von Uexküll or whatever, like the life world of the sea slug or whatever. We could just observe that different animals, well, bats, for example, to take a famous example, are in the same physical world, but are constructing very different representations and understandings of it. And the same applies to us, right? We are, constructing something like who's to say the real thing versus all the different ways different organisms represent real things. There's a big gap there. But all of that, right, now we do the Husserlian thing, like can be understood as stuff playing out in the brackets, right? The biologist studying the sea squirt is seeing the sea squirt, seeing its neurons, and then seeing, oh, and like when we put a light in front of it, this neuron activates. And oh, look, the bats tend to navigate using this method, and humans do things, they're not realizing it in this way. And so that's all like stuff that can be reconstructed phenomenologically. Those are regularities, right? When we probe a sea squirt in this way, we notice that it reacts in this way. And when we compare it to humans, we notice there's this analogy to the human case. And in fact, Ideas 3, the much neglected slim third volume in the Ideas series, is really focused on this, right? He's talking about how different structures in psychology have a kind of eidetic foundation, including structures like the one I just described. So that's how I'd understand what Hoffman was saying.
So in sum, it doesn't much matter, right?
I wouldn't say it doesn't. What do you mean it doesn't matter? I think these are important points. It matters in that
well,
sense.
I mean, the question of what is real, that's kind of a silly question.
Yeah. So what is real? So this is right. What is real? And then at two levels, I'd say, right?
Yeah.
At the level we can't talk about, this is my metaphysical neutrality. And so like matrix, simulation, etc., versus at the level we can talk about. So, sea squirts, that's hard to type, the different organisms, Hoffman, etc. Yeah, these are good points. Some good help.
Okay, thank you, Jeff.
Yeah.
There's one more question from David.
Yeah, let's see. There you go. So yeah, Don Hoffman is getting famous by being a radical idealist. He thinks of himself as a Leibnizian, in fact. And it's interesting to remember where he started, because all of the levels that Jeff's just been talking about are on the table. So where he started was looking at vision. And I remember he attended one of my seminars and he presented some of his early work. You're looking at a screen with 4 white dots on it, and then they start to move, and you cannot help but see the movement of a globe rotating like the Earth on its axis. So now, then he'll explain that with this particular kind of mathematics that he uses a lot. So look at all of the levels there. You've got the practitioners of the computer simulation of vision movement, and the assumption that the brain is actually implementing all of those processes all the time. So Hoffman's whole picture is full of talk about the reality of what the brain is actually doing as opposed to the images that it's producing. So that opens up everything. Yeah, he's getting famous by pretending to be a radical idealist, but he's perfectly happy talking about what the real brain is doing and what the real computers systems are doing. So moving off Don Hoffman himself and clarifying a bit, we're back to epoche. And yeah, back to epoche in Descartes, the pure Descartes of the first and second meditations, just clear as could be. And then the distinctions coming back, just that what Jeff was laying out. We can talk more about the expressions in formal or informal languages about essences or about ideas or noemata in our terms, or you can just gloss that and have just what are the essences that we're talking about here, and then we're of course going to express that in some form of language, formal or not. So enough said. For me, that is.
Thank you, David. I think I agree. Hakamanesh or Suzanne, one of you? Okay.
Yeah, this is more like a historical comment, I guess, but connecting it with code, it made me think of something that I'd never thought about. So I've always been bothered by the fact that Husserl used this Greek word eidos, which is this Platonic word, and there are all these passages where he says positive things about Plato and Platonic idealism. But when you connect it with code, what this made me think of is that, code is rules. And rules are different from essences. And the idea of rules made me think, that kind of reminds me more of something like a Kantian concept than a Platonic idea. So, right before he makes his table of categories, Kant defines concepts as just rules. And the way he develops his categories is saying, okay, we have ways of carrying out judgments, and these judgments have certain forms. And so there are these rules about how we construct propositions, and those rules map onto the a priori categories. So I was thinking of maybe if I have this analogy with code, that kind of helps me think of Husserlian eidos, not in a Platonic kind of idealism, but in more of like a Kantian kind of idealism, if that makes sense. I generally like Kant more than Plato because it's worked out. It's like it's structured and it's clear and it's like completed, right? Whereas a Platonic idealism is all this language is really ambiguous. So I don't know. I'm just wondering if thinking of the analogy with code helps us think of Husserlian eidos in more of a Kantian than a Platonic sense. I don't know if that helps or.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, there was that one slide where I talked about this is like extending beyond the 14 things in Kant to an indefinite multiplicity of them. I think that's right. I think he nods to Plato. He likes the general spirit of this Platonic effort to sort of get beyond the realm of facts and everyday contingent reality to this more kind of atemporal, permanent level of just these essences. There's a story about, the archives were burning, the Nazis were coming, and he said, well, it doesn't, we got to rescue everything. Oh, well, it's all right. The papers come and go, but the ideas are there to be rediscovered. So in that sense, he's kind of Platonic, right? Just like math could be rediscovered, even if some mathematical text is lost. But in practice, he does refer to it. He uses the word rule, he uses the word syntax and regulated series of appearance. I think it's clear from all the writings on it that he does have in mind something like what Kant did. Also, by the way, in the period leading up to the ideas, there's another, I don't know, somebody's got to fact check me on some of these stories, but I think he was teaching Kant like something like 6 days a week at one point. So this is very much, I think, a Kantian phase as well. And so that's clearly in the background. So I think you're right to emphasize those connections.
Mike again.
We're over. Is it over? So I don't have to. Oh.
Yeah, I could keep going. I don't know how everyone's time is.
Yeah, this was just a quick reply to Hakmanish. I'm sorry if I get your name wrong. I think you said Hak was okay. Hakmanish. Just a friendly comment to Hakmanish's point is that even though Husserl often talks in the Platonic language, we have to also keep in mind that he's overtly opposed to Platonism. And repeatedly, he criticizes it from a very early period. So if you can get a theory that can do the job, a lot of the job that we expect Platonism to do, then I think that will be a preferable theory. And the Kantian rules idea, but also the the later Husserl's constant invocation of idea with the capital I, idea in the Kantian sense, I think is designed to serve that purpose. So it's just a supporting comment to Huckmanish. Thank you.
And if I could make an addendum to your addendum, so the Amy Thomason paper I mentioned at the start is very much expands on this in a lot of detail on being Platonist but not Platonist, and a particular way to unfold that. And there was something else I was going to say, but I forgot. So, David.
There we are. Yeah, follow up, just to emphasize again, rules are great, but Kant is at his century and Husserl is almost in the 20th century. So you should think of the mathematics of rules themselves. The rule is itself a particular kind of eidos. Think of a mapping from one space to another, topology, and onward like that. So the fancy kinds of eidoses, so they're just completely different essences. And probably, I've already forgotten the Italian philosopher's scope, but that would be appearing in the problem there. So in other words, yeah, rules are, to go meta on rules, they're a particular kind of eidos, and it's not type token. It's now we got to be, that's what I meant by going ahead with the mathematics to 21st century. So enough said, okay?
Yeah, thumbs up on 21st century.
Terry?
Terry, yeah.
I'm really appreciating this discussion. I'm thinking about how Husserl would be now as a voice in the philosophy of mathematics, the way the philosophy of mathematics has come through the end of the 20th and into the 21st century. And specifically, to think about how much of this this topic is in the context of the struggle against psychologism. And to wonder whether Husserl wouldn't be some kind of structuralist in the philosophy of mathematics, and where category theory has an enormously important role to play, as in a way the mathematical study of structure. And it's just, so I'm saying this thinking about your image in the analogy in of the sweatshop behind
Right.
nature.
Right.
So what do the people who are writing that, what is going on? I mean, how much does your analogy require that the psychology of those programmers is relevant? I mean, have we not sort of, are we not at risk to move the psychologism into the study of those who write the code and the natural language commentary on the code, for that matter?
Yeah. So thank you for that. So a few things. So first of all, with regard to Husserl and the philosophy of mathematics, I'm sure David was anxious to say this perhaps too. I think Hartim, we have the advantage of many scholars working on the topic, and I especially like the work of is it Mirja Hartimo? I think does excellent work on this and really bringing out how like all the categories that have emerged, like Husserl is very pluralist, right? He's got kind of elements of all of them, from Platonist strands with the qualifications Mike and Hakamanish mentioned, to more like one of my colleagues talks about math as manual labor, like the actual practical at the whiteboard kind of side, and structuralist tendencies as well. I just reviewed a book where there was a few papers on Husserl and structuralism. And so I think Husserl is kind of a living, I don't know if he's at the mainstream of like Mike, your colleague Balaguer. I don't know that he wakes up and reads his Husserl every day, but it's certainly there, and I think being increasingly appreciated.
He never.
Okay, all right. So not, maybe it's not in the mainstream, but in a side satellite room at the Philosophy of Math conference, maybe some work's happening, and I think it's certainly relevant. To your question about psychologism, and are we just pushing it back? I mean, I think without even going into the sweatshop, I am treading psychologistic accusations here. I mean, look, I'm talking about things that contingent features of our brains and how brain, and neural patterns unfold as being the basis of these quasi-Platonic, timeless, rediscoverable forms. I think actually, and this is a very tricky question in Husserl, because he's quite sympathetic, I think, to psychology. It's just the particular way it unfolded in the people like Wundt, right, his teacher, and Brentano and others. And I actually have a paper on this, going into a lot of these details that I could send if anyone's interested. But ultimately, I mean, I think the way out is, I mean, there's a few parts of it, but it's this conditionalization I mentioned. I think up here, where maybe it's in the one with the quotes. I don't know, one of these oh no, it's here. Right? The things, it's sort of, if you have this kind of sensory apparatus, or if you have eyes on the sides of your heads, or if you happen to have this kind of neural machinery, then this will happen. So it's all sort of, I think this is a way he could capture some of that, right? Like there are these sort of regularities we observe and their contingencies can kind of be universalized in a way by just putting them into a kind of conditional framework. As for the psychology of the sweatshop laborers, I mean, this kind of goes to the thing of like, this is abstract, philosophical thought experiments. Like, there is something out there causing these regularities. This is a vivid way to talk about them, right? Maybe there's some people in this sweatshop, but yeah, nothing should really rely on the contingencies of, how they happen to be thinking, I think. Yeah, so really good points. Thank you.
David.
Thanks, Jeff.
Well, Jeff, in spite of the flurry of ideas that I was trying to bring in and everyone else has, this idea of conditionalization, I think, was the most profound thing that we've been talking about. And I wondered if anybody understands what morphological essences are. Dallas Willard used to insist on the distinction. But if we think of morphological essences as in effect grounded in the world, which I think is the definition, then what is that world? It's the life world. And there we are with the sensory apparatus that Jeff has mentioned, but also with the social apparatus of everyday language. And that would even be giving an answer to the Hoffman charges or any radical idealist. So conditionalization itself, like conditional probabilities, only it's conditional essences, conditional expressions of theories or judgments of what particular essences there are in the world around us. So that conditionalization is fabulous. So thanks for that, Jeff.
Yeah. Maybe essences expressed as conditionals. Yeah, the stuff on morphological versus exact essences, which doesn't show up a lot. I mean, so Claudio makes a lot out of it. He's got this tripartite distinction. I don't know. I'm just not going to say. I don't know if it does. I agree with what you said in spirit. Whether that particular distinction is the way to make the argument, I'm just not so sure. Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, just a minor point on the morphological essences. The way I was taught it was that morphology is like an outdated scientific method common in botany and zoology during the time, where based on like shape similarity, you would determine that they belong to the same species, because this is before genetic analysis. I think that's where the morphological essences comes from.
Yeah, I mean that's fair. I mean that's often true. Like the genetic stuff, right, comes from an understanding of genetic psychology at the time.
No,
which
I
isn't
mean,
quite-
like they didn't know about genes back then. Like they didn't have DNA stuff. They didn't know about that, right? So the
Right.
way zoologists and botanists would determine what species a tree belongs to is by how similar it is to another tree.
Yeah. No, I was saying in a similar way, we need to understand what Husserl meant by morphological in the context of how the word was used at the time, right? Just as with the word genetic. Now Claudio does try and reconstruct it. It's something like it's one thing, you never get to the triangle from triangle instances, there's some sort of change in kind in ideation versus with redness, it's just sort of the whole series kind of converges. I'm not doing a good job of this. So he tries to reconstruct, independent of its origins, he tries to give a reconstruction. I think others have. I'll stop there though, because I don't really have a take on it. Akaminesh?
Okay, so just to go with the analogy in the other direction, now not towards Husserl and like the historical Husserl, but if we're making this analogy with the computer science, what do you think of this idea that the process for getting the eidetic essences, in other words, this process of variation, where I hold something constant and vary other things?
Right.
Don't we have analogies to that also in the way neural networks are trained? In that the way that the computer processes language is by taking chunks of language and then masking a part of it and then going through variations to find where things are similar, where things are different, and translating those similarities and differences, into linear algebra, basically, into this kind of spatial organization of meaning. Right? So that doesn't go towards the direction of clarifying Husserl, but it could be a way of like giving a descriptive analysis of what the neural network training is doing with the language of phenomenology. So in other words, doesn't like Husserl's process of eidetic variation sound really similar to the way a computer produces a vector embedding for natural language, as at the level of an analogy?
Yeah, well, of course, I'm delighted that you asked this question, being a neural network enthusiast myself. And it's another one of these where there's multiple levels that kind of like want to collapse, but we need to keep apart, I think. So I think that the actual, in that matrix analogy, they're pumping signals into a brain. The brain has a structure in the brain, and it's of course a neural network. And to understand how neural networks work, when they're not in a matrix, when they're trained and operating using their own endogenous principles, and this is again the kind of thing Don Hoffman would look at, neural networks are the way to go, I think. And there are, when you train a neural network with gradient descent, and it's moving, all the weights and parameters are changing, and you've got movement through this complicated these complicated vector spaces in order to produce better behaviors. I think that is what's happening. Like if we were it's not Pac-Man, right? It's neural network human, right? And so like the instantiation of all this in the brain I think is by a neural network. And then this really brings us back to the Q&A. This is why there's a difference between what, the regularities themselves and our natural language expressions of them. Like this neural network is doing some very complicated things, and we're just more or less able to capture that with our human language descriptions. And so the resource I like a lot here is a guy named Paul Smolensky, who wrote a paper called The Proper Treatment of Connectionism, which is like one of my favorite papers in cognitive science. And so there he talks about how really at what he calls the sub-symbolic level, our ability to negotiate the world is like traversing these spaces, right? Harmony landscapes, he calls them. And that what happens, what we have when we describe that propositionally, we're kind of approximating what happens at that level. And so there's some very tricky questions about how essences relate to that. I've just sort of begun gesturing at it with what I just said. I'm not completely happy with my answer, but I'm glad you raised it. I need to think more. I'm going to try and improve it. Yeah, there's like 3 or 4 issues that are kind of crowding together as I think about it. So Ryan, you're going to save me from having to work more on that.
I'm not going to save you, but I am going to offer a comment. I really appreciate the talk. I think it's really interesting, and this discussion is really interesting. But I find myself here at the end a little bit ambivalent about the matrix analogy. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with your matrix analogy. I really love it because it does this thing, which is get us to attend to the essences or attend to the invariant structures of our experience independently of whatever the mechanism is that's producing them. And so I like that. I appreciate that that's what you're doing with it and attempting to do with it. However, I do think that the vividness of the thought experiment also undermines a little bit, right, what you're attempting to do with it, because of course it isn't metaphysically neutral. It raises all the sorts of questions about, right, what the being, what the real story is, right? All the stuff that you say we don't, was unknowable to us in your good kind of like Kantian read of Husserl, like that, it basically is telling us that these things are fake, right? They're not essences in the original Greek sense of being connected with the beings, right? It's the result of manipulation by evil computers or evil computer programmers or whatever the mechanism is. It comes with that kind of like story about how the invariant structures of our experience are produced. So I think at the end, I really like your Pac-Man analogy better with the Martians, right? And the two scenarios for the Martians, the ones that can open up the video game table and the ones that can't open up the video game table, in part because you can preserve a little bit more of the metaphysical neutrality. It doesn't put its finger on the scale and telling us, right, how they're produced immediately. So anyway, that's just a comment, but thanks for the talk. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, wow, Ryan, that's great. I'm really gonna have to think about that. And I think what it brings out, yeah, the thing is, if maybe could I do this all with the Pac-Man thing? Like maybe, I mean, that would be kind of nice. Another, it's like down here in these like hidden notes. It's like another objection. Let's provide more ammunition. Is hey, you're supposed to be making things simpler, but my God, this is the most elaborated, complicated analogy. So if I could just do it with Pac-Man, that would be kind of nicer. But a sketch of a response is something like the response to the Don Hoffman question from Ron. It's that it's one thing, like there's just two versions of the matrix analogy, right? One is it's unbeknownst to us. It's just we don't, I mean, we know about it because we're kind of talking about it, but if it was really the case, we wouldn't know, right? And so I do think we are metaphysically neutral about that. But if it were really happening, right? If we could like see if I could go into a room and say, hey, look, I could see Ryan's actually a brain in a vat now, and the evil programmers are doing that, then it's now not metaphysical. It's like, oh no, in the actual world, we're seeing it happen, and we could then do the kind of Don Hoffman thing. And I mean, of course, to focus on the first way of using it, not the second. My suspicion is that it's not enough to just look, maybe it is, I just don't know. And maybe this whole thing will change from Matrix to Pac-Man, hat tip Brian Hickerson. But my sense is that we need to think about whoever programmed the stuff, but you could do that in Pac-Man. Maybe you're right. Maybe that's a better way to do this. I mean, the thing, of course, with Matrix is that it's a direct link to our experience, right? Whereas Pac-Man is just a little thing on a screen. I don't know. I'll have to think about it. I appreciate that.
David, this might be our last comment or question. And so we are 25 minutes after 12.
Sorry to be jumping in too much. So I think the conditionalization, Jeff, is very interesting. Metaphysical neutrality, the way I've understood you use it, is to consider what Amy Thomason calls, far out metaphysics. Let's stay closer to real life. So that brings in the hinge notion from Wittgenstein, which my colleagues emphasize so much. We are in the life world, and we are the people talking about designing, whether it's the Pac-Man or whether it's the neural network or whether it's from the Martian's perspective, we're always in some sort of context. And that opens to the Merleau-Pontian line of phenomenology coming out of Husserl more than people always emphasize. So think a little more about that. The hinged metaphor is that you can't even get off the ground with what you're saying without presupposing that here we are in, as in Husserl, here we are in this life world in which we are creating the machine to talk about in the matrix. So metaphysics spreads out to the far out stuff or very close. The life world notion is already a limited metaphysical notion, I guess is what I want to say as a clincher here. So I think you've opened up some great space for discussion that's very different from what we're used to. So conditionalization, hinges, ontological dependence, once again, we can't get away from it. So,
how does the hinge metaphor always bothers me? Like, how does the hinge I just think of a door and a hinge. Like, what is it? You can't open a door without a hinge,
you can't swing the door without the hinge.
Can't swing the.
I mean, the original epistemology is here's a hand, five fingers without it, and it's the hinge is just taken on my take, which is not
that's
Wittgensteinian, is that the hinge is in the ontological dependence of everything else that we're doing on where we are. Let's put it in the life world. So that's why I thought it was totally cool that you were going to talk about what the programmers are talking to each other about outside the computer code itself. So my closest avenue to that is that exactly that's what people do when they write code and try to communicate within a system. And you worked in a group, and I've worked in a group, and I listen to a certain party on this all the time. So there's heavy conditionalization in the life world that we're at. And if we bring in the neural networks, we're taking for granted that there are nerves, for starters. And we are a bundle of nerves, among other things. So there's a lot of rich avenue of discussion. Possibly that's why I think someone was saying that Sean Gallagher wasn't too cool in this. Well, because he's emphasizing the Merleau-Pontian side. So there's a lot to explore in this notion of conditional expression and conditional essences themselves. So I think this is great stuff. Thanks, Jeff. Bravo.
Thank you, and thank you everyone else for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation and the wonderful debate afterwards for everyone to contribute.
Thanks for organizing, Susan. Thanks for everybody being here.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Happy New Year. Good to see you, Adam, Michael, and everyone else. Real quick before you hang up, Susie, Statey, where did that comment fit? You said Statey 2 works on this.